Welcome. If you're just joining us today, feel free to respond in the chat. How are you doing? And also go ahead and change your Zoom name to indicate if you would like to focus on ELA or math when we get to that part of the section, that part of the session. All right, thanks, Jeff. Good to see you've changed to math. Tammy's doing ELA. If you need help in changing your name, just let us know. And we'll get started together in just a second. All right, see some excitement in the chat. Okay, and you'll see that Sharissa has put our note catcher in the chat, so you can take a second and go ahead and open that. You can use that for your notes throughout today's session. So welcome. We know that most of you probably don't exclusively focus on one subject area, but for the purposes of today, we ask that there's going to be a time when we break into ELA and math sessions. So you can go ahead and rename yourself with ELA or math. All right. And please make sure you're on mute so that we don't have any background noise. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the fourth PD in our Academic Excellence Roadmap for Leaders series. Today, we're going to be focusing on our time on how we plan to provide all students with access to accelerated learning. So before we dive in, we're going to just spend some time orienting ourselves to our learning. And here's some norms to begin our thinking on what we need to in place to do this work together. So take a couple of seconds and read through those norms and let us know if you have any questions. A couple of things that may be different from other sessions that you go to. One is that we ask if you do need to step away from the computer for any reason, please try to do it during whole group times. It can be awkward when we're in breakout rooms if folks have decided to, leave during those times. Similarly, if you are not able to stay on video the whole time, we definitely recommend prioritizing being on video when you are in breakout groups so that you can fully engage in the smaller groups. When you're in breakouts, if you've like us spent lots of time on Zoom, you'll know that Zoom sort of gives you a countdown when the breakout is almost over. You can just wait, and that's just telling you how much time you have left, but you don't need to come right back as soon as you see that message. You can just let Zoom bring you back. As I've said, we have a note catcher, so please go ahead and open that up. It'll help you during the session, and we will have time during our session for breakouts as well. So just to give you a little bit of background on TNTP, in case you're not familiar with our organization, we were founded in 1997 by teachers who believed that all students deserve great teaching with a particular focus on equity for students who have been historically underserved by school systems. If you've heard of TNTP, you've probably heard of our work in one of these three areas: rigorous academics, talented people, and supportive environments. We offer a range of support from strategic advice to multi-year execution. We work with charter networks, we work with school districts, and we work with state departments of education like DESE. So we with DESE have partnered on a few initiatives, including teacher diversification and kaleidoscope work with deeper learning. We know that this year won't be typical in many ways, but we also know that we're not completely reinventing the wheel. And so this acceleration roadmap, which hopefully you've had a chance to somewhat familiarize yourself with since it's come out, it's not necessarily things that are new. It could be things that you have heard about before, things that you've tried before. Really, the goal here is that our learning acceleration approach will support bringing your students into grade level instruction and supporting their well-being. If you've had a chance to dig into the roadmaps, you've seen that there's a school leader version and there's also a teacher version. And they're both designed to provide a focused and phased approach to supporting students in the 21-22 school year. And that year, we know, which is coming soon, it will be a year that will lay a foundation for accelerated learning really over the next several years. We know this work won't be done just in this coming school year. To develop these roadmaps, we heard from educators, school leaders, district leaders, students, community members from across the Commonwealth. So hopefully what you'll see is that these roadmaps are uniquely aligned with the needs of students across the Commonwealth and also the existing tools and resources that DESE provides. So if you attended or watched any of our previous session or you watched the recording of our initial webinar, you might remember that this roadmap is organized around 3 overarching priorities. One is fostering a sense of belonging and partnership among students and families. The second is continuously monitoring students' understanding. And finally, ensuring grade appropriate instruction with just-in-time scaffolds when they are needed. And you may have heard that accelerated learning is largely or primarily about intentionally planning for these just-in-time instructions or scaffolds. And that is something that you will see continually throughout our session. So our overarching goal for today is that you'll walk away with having met these objectives, establishing their academic focus for the year based on your school's instructional materials and current student academic needs. That you'll have time to create a plan for how you align observation, coaching, and professional learning priorities to this focus area. And then finally, that you'll have some time to develop improvement cycles in key areas to ensure students continue to experience equitable, high-quality learning experiences. Okay, I think I'll pass it to you, Irene.
Great, thanks, Versha. Hi, everyone. My name is Irene Tuske, and I'm a senior manager here. And before we jump in, I want to give a few more just housekeeping notes. The handout, which hopefully you've seen the link for in the chat, includes a PDF version of the slides you are looking at. At the top, there's a link. It says PDF of the slides. I highly recommend you open that and keep it open throughout our session because you might find it useful to go back and look at some of the slides as we go through this. Again, the objectives for today, we know that you're likely going to need to go back to your school and meet with your teams to accomplish fully these objectives, but really today is an opportunity to begin that planning and brainstorming. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So as we know, there are many interrelated components that make up strong instruction. So we have high quality instructional materials, data informed supports, culturally responsive practices, and so forth. Versha, would you mind animating the slide? And you can go ahead and click right through. Thank you. So for our purposes, and given this unique period in education that we find ourselves today we're going to be zeroing in on only one aspect of strong instruction in ELA and math that we believe will influence your academic vision for this year. More specifically, we'll be looking at how teachers can effectively prepare to address unfinished learning through intentionally planning for just-in-time instruction. So last year, you may have heard the terms prioritize content or prioritize standards, and we want to make sure that we're transitioning away from this type of thinking since it no longer suits our current context. So the nature of the last school year with the closures and modified instructional structures, they put, as I'm sure you all know, real limitations and strain on our instructional time. So these prioritization lists that came out last year, they were really an acknowledgement of that issue. However, as we move forward, it's really important that we do not start or continue to eliminate or overly prioritize certain grade level standards over others. The reality is that the grade level standards that you are working with that guide your educator's instruction, they are already focused on the most important content of the grade level. So their construction speaks to a level of coherence that, if not received year after year, as we know, can cause real and lasting damage to students' overall success and readiness. We also know that prioritizing and eliminating grade level standards from the instructional year can also really lead to real inequities, because this is done inconsistently across different classrooms, which then continues to harm and target our system's most vulnerable students. So instead, we are encouraging systems to prioritize the most essential prerequisite content and concepts from prior grades instead, and address them when it is the most relevant time to address them. So again, we are prioritizing this year. What we're prioritizing is not certain grade level standards over others. Instead, we're prioritizing what is the most essential learning from previous grades and what practices can we prioritize to address this content while giving the greatest access and opportunity to grade level content as possible. First, could you go to the next slide, please? So this slide is a basic illustration of what we typically see in systems that are focused on reteaching for extended periods of time and over remediation. So what you see are figures A, B, and C. Those figures represent prior year's content, prior grade levels. And what often happens is that systems or schools will see their student data, the outcomes from the last year, and in great alarm will plan and scope and sequence the current year to include an extended period of time for remediation and addressing content from the previous year. And you can see in the slide on your screen that in this particular case, that period of over remediation extends through winter break. What we see then happen is at that point around winter, early spring, with the impending pressure of state exams, educators will pull themselves out of this state of over remediation and then jump into grade level content. And what we see happens here is that instruction at this point, there's a great amount to cover, and instruction can begin to feel incoherent for students because this structure implies that they're constantly looking back, and it implies this idea that in order to accomplish and learn new content, all old content has to be mastered. So this may feel right or intuitive, might be reminiscent of how we ourselves studied in high school or cramming for college, but cognitive research shows that this is not effective. It illuminates the fallacy in this type of thinking. So while these learning practices, they may lead to short-term results, they don't actually lead to that long-term sustained learning that we know students need, because students are not learning within a context. There's focus more so on discrete skills, and therefore it's not an effective learning strategy. So would you mind animating the slide, Versha? So just to reiterate again, this is what over remediation looks like: an extended period of time of looking at prior year's content, followed by moving into grade level content in very distinct ways. Thanks, Harsha. So for acceleration-minded educators, on the other hand, their approach to instruction is very different. So rather than engaging in remediating strategies, educators rely on concepts like just-in-time instruction that takes unfamiliar concepts or concepts from previous grade levels, and it uses those to scaffold students into grade level learning. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom, educators, hopefully in collaborative ways with their grade level teams, they review the current grade level content, which is represented here by letters D, and they identify the content from prior grades that students must understand to access that grade level content. Versha, could you animate, please? Thank you. So this educator or this team of educators have identified that some aspects of A, prior grade level content, and C, prior grade level content are critical for the current grade level. But B, prior content learning is not at all necessary for this year of learning. Moreover, these teachers also realize that while important, not all of A and not all of C content is critical. So even here, the educators have been selective and identified specifically what about A and what about C standards or prior grade level content and skills is necessary for the current grade. And then finally, acceleration-minded educators, they recognize that learning within context is critical. So while these educators recognize that A and C are important prior grade level concepts, they're not blocking out massive periods of time to teach all of those concepts together at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the semester. Instead, they're choosing proximity, meaning that they're highlighting those prior year concepts when they are most applicable to the current or most immediate grade level content. So as you look at this example, you may be wondering if this looks the same in all content areas. And it's an important question because there are slight differences in how you may approach acceleration or just-in-time learning and instruction per content area. And today we're going to go into breakout groups to discuss ELA and math. But what we do want to share with you is that the guiding principles for acceleration that we want teachers to be following that are effective, those remain the same across content areas. And so before we break into ELA and math groups, we're going to take a look at those three principles for accelerated learning. Next slide. Thank you. So saying that we accelerate learning, it connotes that our system, our schools, our educators, leaders are leaning into these three key principles that you see on the slide. So understanding grade level content, diagnosing student understanding, and taking action by effectively planning for instruction. So we're going to read a little bit more about each of these, but I would like you to keep in mind that what you see on the slide only highlights a few items for each principle, and a more comprehensive list is in your handout. So let's look at understand. So understanding grade level content, that means knowing what this looks like in practice, knowing your content deeply, knowing the best materials that you have available to use, and also knowing what the prerequisite skills and knowledge are that students need to successfully access and navigate their current grade level rigorous instruction. So a teacher, again, needs to have a deep understanding of their content. Then we have diagnose. So we're diagnosing student understanding of those prerequisite concepts and skills in order to understand what do students, what do they know and what do they not understand yet. It's important to highlight here that we're not talking about those big formal diagnostics that we typically see systems across the country use at the beginning of the year. In this case, we're talking about curriculum embedded, unit specific, lesson specific diagnostics and daily formative assessments. And then finally, taking action. So we take action by planning for and executing effective instructional practices. So we're pairing the knowledge of students with the educator's knowledge of high quality grade level content to devise and execute meaningful instruction and systems of support for all students. So the first step to accelerate learning is ensuring that, again, educators deeply understand what learning acceleration is in practice, then knowing what that means within their content area, and then even more specifically, what that means within their grade level and a particular lesson. So right now, we're going to continue unpacking these principles and what they look like in ELA and math. So many of you have already changed your Zoom name to include the subject area you'd like to look at today. But if you're having some trouble deciding, just for a little bit more context, in ELA, we're going to look at a 7th grade example. In math, we'll look at a 5th grade example. And again, both sections will look at understanding, diagnosing, and taking action. And also, you will have access to this recording to review the subject that you do not attend today. So we'll give you all a bit of time to both process and determine which subject you would like to attend by changing your name. And Teresa, our Zoom manager, whenever you are ready, feel free to break us into groups. Welcome to the breakout small group learning session on how to accelerate learning in ELA. So what does it mean to accelerate learning in literacy? First, to accelerate learning in literacy, it's important that educators have a solid understanding of what it means to teach students to read. For decades, our country has been gripped in several rounds of reading wars that often left educators asking, is phonics instruction important? What's wrong with balanced literacy? What about whole language? And so on. These questions continue to circulate through systems, even though definitive evidence-based research has been out for nearly 15 years about how children, especially young children, learn to read. Although we have this information, educators have not all embraced the idea that for most students, roughly 70% of all children, learning to read requires that educators and caregivers work to develop students in 2 critical areas. The first one being reading each word in text accurately and fluently, otherwise known as skill-based competencies, commonly also called phonics or foundational skills. And 2, comprehending the meaning of text being read. So meaning-based competencies, sometimes called reading comprehension. Accelerating each of these competencies can look slightly different. For our purposes, we're going to focus on meaning-based competencies. To accelerate learning in the reading comprehension space, educators begin with grade-level appropriate complex text. Once complex texts are in place, educators must understand the key topics and qualitative aspects of that text in order to prepare to accelerate learning. In other words, what about the way this text is written is worthy of discussion and instructional time? For this example, I'd like for you to envision a 7th grade ELA classroom, where the teacher has already gone through the process of selecting a grade level appropriate text through a qualitative and quantitative analysis. If that's new for you or your teams, look to the website achievethecore.org for more support on how to perform a qualitative and quantitative analysis of complex text. Throughout their 7th grade year, students will read and discuss texts about individuals that overcome and persevere in the face of incredible obstacles. The anchor or core text for the first unit of the year is A Long Walk to Water. Please take a moment and read the brief summary on the slide. While 7th graders may be able to read this text in a foundational skills way, in other words, students can decode the words of the text and read it fluently, they might miss the key ideas of the text or even misinterpret what the author is trying to convey because they lack the background knowledge or vocabulary development needed to fully comprehend and express what is happening in the text. In that case, students may need advanced preparation with the topics covered and the language used in A Long Walk to Water. In meaning making or reading comprehension, we can accelerate learning through building prior knowledge and developing academic vocabulary. Take a moment to read about the topics covered in A Long Walk to Water that are displayed on your screen. In the case that students are unfamiliar with these topics, educators might have students read the supplemental text, Lost Boy, Lost Girl, or How Dare the Sun Rise, prior to the start of A Long Walk to Water, or alongside beginning that unit. These two texts are informational texts, which can often be more easily accessible, especially for multilingual learners. And these texts cover the same time period and region as A Long Walk to Water, but they are also slightly less complex. Because all three texts cover the same topics, students are building the background knowledge that they need to tackle A Long Walk to Water, and they're also familiarizing themselves with the kind of academic language and vocabulary that they will most likely encounter in the core text. Reading supplemental text is not the only way to build background knowledge and prepare students to access complex text. Activities that activate prior knowledge by leveraging students' assets and funds of knowledge support with schema building, which in turn provides students greater access to grade level tasks or texts that they otherwise would not have been able to easily access. Take a moment and read some of the suggestions specific to this text in the blue box. Activities that activate prior knowledge by leveraging students' assets and funds of knowledge have a multitude of benefits. They affirm student identity, and they also acknowledge that students come to the classroom with knowledge and experiences that can be used as resources for their own learning as well as the learning of their peers. Activating prior knowledge also brings critical information, including vocabulary and language, to the surface where it's more readily able to be applied. Activating prior knowledge also provides for more entry points or access for students to make connections through strengthening schema building. These activities are usually collaborative and allow students to negotiate concepts in oral, familiar language, including their home language, to enable greater access. These activities should also focus on the central concepts at the heart of the lesson or unit to establish a base upon which subsequent new learning is made more comprehensible. These activities should also rely on visual supports, and it is fine to use minimal text or text with a low linguistic load in order to grant access to all students regardless of literacy level. When a student is struggling with accessing text, the solution is not remediation. We can accelerate understanding by focusing on these key meaning-based practices of knowledge building, vocabulary building, and focusing on reading comprehension. So to highlight a few, let's look at knowledge building. So for example, build on research that highlights the best practice of using informational text, focus on the anchor topic to build knowledge. Again, informational texts tend to be more accessible for students who are learning English, and they also provide those opportunities to activate and build background knowledge in order to prepare to read an anchor text. Vocabulary building. So create opportunities for students to use the words they are learning in their writing and speaking. So it's critical that vocabulary building opportunities are authentic and meaningful, and that they allow for students to produce the vocabulary in their own authentic ways so that they develop true ownership over the new vocabulary and language that they're building. And finally, reading comprehension. Continue to emphasize the importance of careful, focused communal reading of complex text in reading comprehension instruction. This tends to take the shape of having well-sequenced, scaffolded text-dependent questions, which can support students with building their understanding of a complex text through questions that develop their comprehension of the topics and themes occurring. So now that we have a clearer picture of what strong, accelerated instruction looks like in literacy, let's pause for a moment and consider how close or far your current system is from that vision of acceleration. As you think about the first question, Keep in mind what data you are considering, what resources lead you to believe, who are the various stakeholders that you must engage with in order for strong literacy instruction to take place.
Welcome to the Accelerate Learning in Math Breakout Group. Let's begin. In math, just like in all other subject areas, such as social studies and science, a teacher might begin with a year-long scope and sequence that looks similar to the one that you see here. Let's take a look. Here we see some broad topics that will be covered within the grade. We also have an opportunity to see those topics that are covered across the grade. When we look at this scope and sequence here, we begin to be able to see connectivity. It gives us an opportunity to see coherence within the grades as well as across the grades. This is critical in the success of learning acceleration in math. A teacher that is accelerated minded will look at the year-long scope and sequence and then decide on the focuses for the grade for the year. They will also look at the major content and the concepts. The example that you see here is taken from a high quality math curriculum, Eureka Math. So as we look closely at this projected pacing guide, that's also similar to Eureka Math, and we look at this curriculum, we're able to see the exact amount of time that is invested in each of the major work of the grade focus domains for grade 5. We know that grade 5 is the bridge builder for deepening the conceptual understanding of fractions and as well as operations and algebraic thinking that's also built into 4th grade. 5th grade is also essential in building the conceptual understanding of the number system for grade 6. Acceleration in math demands a concentration on understanding the marriage between the major work of the grade and the supporting work of the grade for each of the grades, along with the prerequisite skills and concepts. An accelerated minded teacher would look at the grade level content that they have to cover and then consider what prior knowledge and understanding might the students need and what the teacher might need to explore. In this particular case, we see that the teacher recognizes that they must explore the student's ability to demonstrate an understanding of the concepts, the skills, and the academic language that's associated with multiplication and division of both whole numbers and fractions. They must also think about multiplicands and multipliers. These concepts and skills are most frequently associated with and related to 5th grade content material that students need to access at the 5th grade level. Let's go a little deeper and take a look at another example of what learning acceleration really entails. One teacher may look at their curriculum and get a general sense of the concepts that are required to be taught, but they also want to look at the concepts that need to be explored. The accelerated minded teacher will work to get more granular and specific. For example, that teacher may look to see what's in the first unit of study for the year, and they would also access tools to see coherence, similar to those used at DESE in the Standards Navigator, so that they can understand what prior grade materials and standards are related to their current grade and need to be covered during this course of this year. So you see here in this example, you will notice that in Unit 1, there are 5 standards that are covered, and each of these standards is coherently linked to the other standards within grade 5. This is critical as well to make sure that we have an understanding of the within grade coherence that is taking place so that we can effectively accelerate students' learning in mathematics. We'll also begin to notice that there are supporting standards that are related. But here we're going to look at the five major standards that appear in this particular grade. For each of these five standards, we'll notice that there are connecting coherence standards from the previous grade. So when we see the things that will be covered in fifth grade, we can clearly see which standards are aligned to the prior grade level standards for fifth grade. Notice that the fifth grade standards are highlighted in white, and the fourth grade standards that connect to these are highlighted in yellow. Knowledge of the coherence of the standards is imperative, and I cannot say that enough. Knowledge of the coherence of the standards is imperative when you're planning those just-in-time scaffolds for learning acceleration. It's important to also note that when we have related previous grade standards, that does not necessarily mean that the previous grade standard has to be mastered in its entirety before teaching the current grade level standards. And it also doesn't mean that with the prior grade level content, that's always the immediate next step. So a teacher has to get a sense of the content for the prior grade, as well as the content for the current grade, to make sure that incorporating the prior grade level standards does not inhibit student learning, and that learning is accelerated. The accelerated driven teacher will assess students to determine if this is whole group, small group, or individual student issues. When teachers do this by assessing first for the prior grade level standards, it ensures that the students will have an opportunity to engage in just-in-time instruction as opposed to just-in-case instruction. Just-in-time instruction means that the students are experiencing the learning with the coherence of the standards that are properly aligned at that particular time. Whereas the concept of just-in-case teaching requires that we just cover everything just in case the students have a gap. And that is not appropriate for learning acceleration. Here, let's take another look, and an even deeper look, and another example of an accelerated minded teacher and what it means to accelerate learning and provide those just-in-time scaffolds. You have seen this slide earlier today, and it's a potential snapshot of how learning acceleration is driven and what the learning acceleration teacher would do to approach learning acceleration and have that vision for acceleration during the school year. Here you see that an accelerated minded teacher will get an understanding of what students know by first diagnosing those students using a diagnostic. They will diagnose and assess those prerequisite content skills as the basis of their assessment. Once that teacher gets that data back, then that teacher can make decisions and align and adjust instruction accordingly. They will be able to provide alignment and instruction for whole class assignments, small group, and individual student assignments and supports, whether it be through year-long units or at the lesson adjustment level. The teacher and the school can use this information to then accurately match students for their appropriate tier level for their systems of support and decide if they're best suited for tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 systems of support. Finally, at the teacher level, the teacher takes action on supporting the students to access grade level content that includes just-in-time instruction. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can follow the teacher's process. Notice that the green and the green and the red represent the prior grade level skills, and those were diagnosed first. Then we see on this timeline where the teacher aligned and adjusted and made adjustments to decide what were the best systems of support. And finally, the teacher then will be able to take action and support the students at the actual grade level and provide grade level support while still providing those just-in-time instructional scaffolds that focus on some of the prerequisite skills. And here we noticed that in gold, we saw the grade level skills and the teacher took action only on those MBT standards because that was based on the data, that was the only thing that was needed in the first 20 days. So as we think about learning acceleration and making sure that we have a vision for learning acceleration, we need to remember that learning acceleration is not solely about what educators determine they need to teach. Learning acceleration also involves the approach that teachers take, the approach that they take in developing relationships with their students, and that they're careful to foster the students' identity as learners and as mathematicians. Here on the screen, you see a resource, which is Dismantling Racism, and this resource can be found on page 19 of your roadmap. This resource provides educators with guidance on how to begin deconstructing racism in mathematics instruction. In order for us to embody anti-racist education in mathematics, teachers must engage in a critical analysis and truly synthesize and interrogate their ways of thinking so that they can truly give thought to how they perpetuate white supremacy culture in their own classrooms. After doing so, they should then develop a plan toward dismantling racism and providing for an anti-racist classroom around mathematics instruction, and be very careful to address those issues of equity for Black, Latinx, and multilingual students. So now we're gonna try to center ourselves around this concept of acceleration. Centering the concept in math instruction simply means that we have to embrace critical do's and don'ts of acceleration in math. I'm going to pause here and give you 1 minute to read the table that you see before you that includes several of the do's and don'ts of strong accelerated math instruction. Now that you've had an opportunity to get a clearer picture of what strong accelerated instruction looks like in the math classroom, we're going to take some time here to now reflect, and we're going to pause. I want you to consider your own personal context and ask yourself, just how close or how far are you in your current system from incorporating this vision of acceleration? As you think about these questions that you see on the screen, you want to keep in mind what data supports what you're considering. When you look at question number 1, you want to think about the data that you're collecting, what resources you're going to possibly need, and how you will be able to get your stakeholders to engage in this vision of acceleration. And lastly, I want you to truly assess your own personal perception of your system and think about what needs to be in place.
Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you had some time to dig in, and I know certainly on the math side, just hear each other's ideas, thoughts, and how you're approaching this work. So now we're going to move into the second part of our session, which is creating a plan for how we will align observation, coaching, and professional learning priorities to these focus areas. And so consider a success you've had in growing teacher practice. What are the specific actions that led to that success? And so we'd love to hear from you in the chat. What do the most successful leaders do when launching an observation and feedback practice at their school? Or what will you need in order to implement systems to maintain a regular practice of observation and feedback? So sort of moving into really thinking about how to really approach instructional leadership as we move into this school year. All right, thanks for getting us started, Matt. Building upon prior professional learning. And when we've done some of these sessions, we've heard from folks like, actually, now that I think about some of these accelerated learning priorities, those were our priorities as we were planning pre-pandemic, as we were planning for the 2021 school year pre-pandemic, we were thinking about some of these practices or considering how to accelerate learning. So again, some of these ideas may not be brand new, but going back to practices that we thought about or implemented prior to the pandemic. Thanks for your comments there, Molly. Begin with questions that are tied to whole school instructional goals. Ask teachers about their decision-making, certainly entering with some curiosity. Thanks for your comments, Allison and Doug. So yeah, continue thinking about what do you, and again, this past year required you to wear so many hats as leaders. So we wanted to provide some opportunity to really ground us in like, what do we know is good instructional leadership practice? And when we think about providing equitable and effective systems of support for students, we also want to acknowledge that you as leaders need to really create systems that consider broader systems of support and work to ensure that those systems are strategically aligned to support core instruction. So again, these are concepts that may have existed prior to the pandemic, but we sometimes use this framework with levers to consider which levers you can use to systematize change. And these levers that we've listed here, expectations, tools, support, and time, these are levers that can impact teacher behaviors and then student outcomes. So we're going to discuss them a little bit and then support you in really planning how you might be thinking about this year and how to get teachers on board with accelerated learning. So if, let's say, for example, a change or a system that you're looking to implement this coming school year is engaging teachers in or setting the expectation that teachers provide more frequent formative assessments and use those assessments to drive instruction and drive the use of scaffold. First, we want to think about, as leaders, what are the precise expectations of the adults in that situation? So consider how frequently formative assessments should be used. What are you looking for when you go into classrooms? How will you know if teachers are engaged in that data cycle? It might be also how things like PLCs are used. Then we want to think about the tools. So if teachers are to administer and effectively use formative assessments, will they need those assessments provided to them? Do they have access to high quality assessments? What tools might they need? And along with that, what support might they need? So in our math group, we started thinking about teacher professional development. What kind of content support teachers might need to really, especially newer teachers, to know how to plan for those just-in-time scaffolds. And then finally, time. We never have enough time, but consider what are all the opportunities, whether it's during formal professional development, other collaborative planning times that teachers have. What are those times that teachers can really use to build in your focus on accelerated learning? So we also want to think about what successful leaders do at the very beginning of the school year in order to ensure a culture of observation and feedback. And again, These may not look surprising to you because many of you already do these things. So as we look into these steps, you'll notice that a theme here is consistency. Consistency in following the schedule, consistency into getting into those classrooms and observing, consistency in giving and following up on feedback. So consistency leads to results, and results leads to greater buy-in from teachers. We know that if teachers feel like they're getting helpful feedback and that feedback is leading to results, these practices will become part of the culture and the operation of the school itself. So knowing all of that going into the school year, and to the extent possible, we would encourage you to really think about what it's going to take to establish this culture of observation and feedback. We also know that effective learning acceleration requires quick and tight student data collection cycles. And again, we've talked about just-in-time scaffolds and the use of formative assessments. So teachers are going to need action steps that are high leverage. They're going to need action steps that are measurable, and they're going to need those bite-sized action steps that allow them to take action in a way that's manageable. And so, we want to consider, as we move into this school year, how to establish a culture of collaborative preparation and observation feedback. So after the planning that you've just done, reflection, we want you to have, consider these questions about classroom observations, when you'll be conducting classroom observations, how you'll prepare for feedback meetings, and how you'll protect that time. So ensuring that teachers implement their feedback, and also that the leadership team can share their observation data with each other. So one thing we'd want you to consider, all of this is sort of typical observation feedback, getting the school year ready. As you're now considering what an acceleration focused classroom might look like, what are some things that you might look for as you're observing class that might be different from a previous year? So you might have had your standard look-fors in doing observations. What might be different this year? So let's go ahead and chat some thoughts there. What might you be looking for in classrooms this year to tell you that teachers are focused on acceleration? Okay, thanks for getting us started, Karen. Dip sticking for student understanding, absolutely. Decision-making process. Kim, if you don't mind coming off mute, not to put you on the spot, but Kim, would you mind sharing how might you learn more about teachers' decision-making process?
I mean, I suppose it could be observed just through the classroom, but also in a follow-up. I'd like to hear what data they had and then the decisions they made around that to support that instruction. I think it would be challenging to observe, so I would have to probably rely on a discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. And I think that brings up an important point, because as you're considering how you'll spend your time, that would be something that you'd need to build in time for, right? How do I have those discussions? Maybe what's that set of questions that I'm going to want to ask teachers in conjunction with observations, maybe that are more data focused than previous years, or maybe more formative assessment focused than previous years. So now we're going to move into what we're calling improvement cycles, and specifically focus on developing improvement cycles in key areas to ensure that students continue to experience equitable, high-quality learning experiences. We know, and we talked about this in the math breakout a little bit, about how, rather than thinking about the school year as a whole, really thinking about the school year in chunks, and knowing that perhaps, we can't plan to implement all of this at the beginning of the year for the whole year. So how do we build in those cycles of continuous improvement and then make changes when necessary? And so one way of thinking about that, and some resources that are in the roadmap, is really guiding you to think about the school year in phases. Now, right now, we're in the planning phase, and for the most part, that's what we've discussed today. But if you have the bandwidth and the opportunity, we'd also encourage you to peek ahead and think about how your academic focus will come alive and how you're going to monitor progress to ensure that there's continuous improvement in student outcomes and teacher practice throughout the school year. So much of the work over the summer is really focused on planning and launching the school year. After you've gotten through that, you'll want to consistently look at data to determine if the goals you've set are coming to fruition. And in order to do that, you'll need to have a plan for data analysis and for professional learning time. So for example, if you're going into this school year with a goal around K-2 literacy and certain benchmarks, you'll want to have dedicated time and capacity to review student data in aggregate and by subgroup. You'll want to have time to collaboratively analyze trends and plan next steps. You'll want to have that built-in professional learning time to refine your approach to increasing literacy at your school. And that cycle will continue throughout the year, and it may change throughout the year as you are building capacity within your buildings. So while there's a range of principles that can guide the process of continuous improvement, at its core, it's about working with these questions and with the educators in the school community to understand a stated problem that is impacting student experience, and then figuring out what are the ideas that can begin to impact that problem. And so we have these three key questions here. What problem are we trying to solve? What changes might we introduce and why? And how will we know that the change is an improvement? This past year, maybe you didn't have the opportunity to continually go through these cycles and pause and ask yourself those questions, because so much of this past year for many of us was about survival, was about keeping people healthy, was about getting through the day and keeping school open in whatever way we needed to do that. And so as we go into this year, I'm hopeful that we will be able to take a more proactive approach and really start with this focus on continuous improvement. So consider your academic focus area that you identified earlier, whether that was in ELA and math. And again, consider what problem you're trying to solve, what changes you might introduce, and how will you know the change is an improvement. We heard lots of interesting ideas in our breakout groups and wanted to create some space to bring them into the broader group. So if you're willing to share either something that you're thinking about in terms of how a change you're going to introduce or how you might know a change is an improvement, please go ahead and type your name in the chat. If you don't feel like speaking out loud, you can also just type your idea in the chat, and we'll hopefully hear from some voices and see some ideas. And I was told that Bethany had some great insight on IEPs. Bethany, I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
Sure, no problem. We were just talking about the fact that special education, by nature is very rooted in remediation. And so we have IEPs that are all written for specific, remediation of specific skills that are not necessarily linked to grade level content. And so it ends up being a lot of remediation, outside of a context, and that we're going to have to do a lot of training of teachers to get them to understand, acceleration versus remediation, and then also in the way that we're actually writing IEPs to support access to grade level instruction.
Absolutely. And that's something, Bethany, that we've heard across our sessions has been this need to really rethink, like, what does this mean for kids with IEPs? And it's not, necessarily intuitive. So thank you for getting us started. Michelle, would you mind coming off mute and sharing this question with the group?
Sure. So one of the things that we were sort of discussing in our group was, the need for kids to be reading and accessing the grade level text. But we also know with research in the reading process that kids also need to have opportunities to be reading at their level, to be able to practice these skills and put them into place. And so I'm sort of wondering, where do these opportunities sort of fit in? Because, if they're 2 years below grade level, of course, we want them to access the grade level text so that they could be getting the content, the language, the vocabulary, all of those rich things. But at some point, they also need to be practicing their reading to be able to apply the skills and be able to apply the strategies. And so my sort of thinking is like, where does this fit in this sort of teaching?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've particularly heard that question around middle school, right? You might have students in middle school who are reading, several grade levels below independently. And what I would say that, main focus here is really providing access. And again, thinking about the just in time rather than just in case, which requires continual assessment. So we've certainly seen students, or teachers act as gatekeepers with providing that, leveled reading or reading that's thought to be independent, and then kids get stuck at that level and don't have those opportunities to access. So it's really considering what the child's day looks like and where there are the opportunities. As you said, there should be opportunities to access grade level text. And there might be some students there are always some students who also need a chance to work independently at their grade level. And it's finding that balance, also building in that continual formative assessment so that as a child is ready to take on more complex text independently, they can. And one other thing I would add to that is sometimes what we see in schools is that the kids who need the most support instructionally don't actually get a lot of independent time. They always have a teacher with them. And so the teacher is, front loading what the book is going to be about, and then gives them a couple minutes to read, and then is, debriefing it. And so really thinking about what are those genuine opportunities. Meanwhile, other students have lots of time to work independently and, get that practice and are reading more. And so continue, just increasing their ability to access grade level text. So really, I would say like taking a deep dive and looking at the course of a student's day. When do they have access to grade level text? When might they need time to independently read lower level texts? And then how much independent time do they have to truly practice and try things out on their own? And so I see Kim, talking about supplemental text. And so actually, Kim, that was, you were in our math breakout group, but that is, and hopefully you'll get a chance to look at the slides too. That is one of our recommendations for really addressing ELA. Supporting an ELA is using supplemental text and building that back, exactly what you said. So thank you for bringing that to the whole group. Any other thoughts? Okay, so with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. This was the fourth in our series. This was prioritizing strong instruction. The last session in our series is going to be this Wednesday. It is developing your teachers and leaders. Before you hop off, please do our survey. We really rely on your feedback. We spend so much time looking at it and read every single comment and then plan our next sessions. Even though the next one's on Wednesday, we will change it based on your feedback. So please take a couple of minutes and give us your feedback before you even get off this Zoom. We build in a few minutes at the end so that we can really get that survey feedback. And as leaders, you know how important that is. So, if you are unable to attend that last session or you're looking for our previous sessions, those are available asynchronously. I know that many of you mentioned that, what about the rest of my leadership team? If the rest of your leadership team has some time to watch the asynchronous sessions, that could save you from kind of reteaching this to your leadership team. You can just direct them to watching those as pre-work maybe for your first leadership team meetings. And you can certainly use those with teachers as well. We also have a session for series for teachers that's starting in August. The first one is on August 10th. So if you have teachers who are into going to sessions over the summer, please encourage them to sign up. And Tabitha has chatted in, or Shira says chatted in our PD flyer. So go ahead and use that for sign up. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Irene or myself. And Sharissa has placed also Thelma's and Tabitha, all of our facilitators' email addresses in the chat. So thank you. It was wonderful to engage with you all today, and hope that you enjoy the rest of your summer if we don't see you again. And please do the survey and then have a wonderful afternoon.